All right. Well, welcome to the podcast and the webinar. Rev Blair Odney from the United Church and the Pacific Region United Church, and really wanted to thank you, Rev Blair, to join us and really share with us kind of your background and the mission, your personal vision and mission, and how you got involved and are now a religious leader and leading a very strong congregation here in British Columbia.
Wow, that's a big question. And like, where do you start? Um, I'll tell you this, that I'll tell you a funny story. When I'm going to say 7 years old, we used to go to church as a family regularly. We faithfully, and we dressed up like little adults because we used to do that then. You know, I had a little blazer and a little vest, and one morning, my parents, for reasons I still don't know, chose to sleep in on a Sunday morning, and I was confused by that. And I'm 7, and so I'm confused by that. And I thought, well, maybe if we can't go to church, church can come home. So I remember that my mother had a pair of satin blue mandarin pajamas with white collars and white cuffs. And I thought, oh, perfect. So I put the pajamas on backwards. So I had a little white collar and a dark front. And I looked just like the preacher that we saw. And I went into their bedroom, knocked, and I read from the only story that I knew from the Bible, because I'd read it at our school assembly. It was the Christmas story from the Gospel of Luke in the Christian scriptures. And I read my parents this story dressed as this preacher in these mandarin pajamas on backwards. And I've often reflected that leadership in the church kind of started there. But that's 100 years ago. Okay, I'm not that old, but that was a while ago. And my route to leadership in the church has had a circuitous path, and it has taken me, and I've had other careers, and it's taken me in different places. But I've always served the church as a lay person. I've served every lay role that you can have in a congregation, and including a music director. I'm a musician, and I've been the minister of music in a couple of congregations. But I was called to ministry I'm going to say about 1998. It's a second career for me, while I was on the staff at a retreat center of the United Church. It's north of Penticton in the Okanagan. Naramata is the village. The center is Naramata Center. I'd been hired by the center to be their manager of marketing and fund development 5 years earlier. And I experienced a call to ministry. I told you it was circuitous. How I got there? Well, and then I entered a program to be trained in community. So I was a student minister in a Soyuz for 3 years before I was recognized by the region then conference. So I've been in congregational ministry in 4 locations in BC since 1998. I'm currently serving in my role. I mean, I have a congregation here. It's a fascinating ministry that's happening here. Not unlike a lot of United Church congregations that are experiencing a transformation. But I'm in my role, and the reason we met is I'm the president of the Pacific Mountain Regional Council of the United Church of Canada. That's the next level judicatory of congregations. It's the next kind of oversight body. It's where accountability for congregations, accountability for congregations' relationships with their ministers is held. My membership in the church, in the United Church of Canada, is held by the region. So I serve as the spiritual leader in an elected role for a period of time, and I'm serving in that role now. That's a
And
start. Is it leading you anywhere? Like,
it is, and just to share with everybody how you and I connected was through Rev Carey Hopeman
correct.
Haynes from Crossroad United Church, and I believe the First United Church with the food distribution that you folks do on the downtown east side, and then also Christine Boyle, the Vancouver City Councillor, and that's also part of the United Church, and so. It's interesting you mentioned that you were 7 years old and you had that interesting journey. So I grew up in another small town called Fort St. John, British Columbia,
Oh my
which
goodness.
the Peace River region, and
Sure.
so we were probably one of the very few families from India and Pakistan there. And my neighbors were Christian, particularly I think they were Catholic, as far as I can tell. And so every Sunday they would come pick me up and I would join them. And so that's how I got to really, even as a Muslim kid, I think it was 2 years that we went, and it was just being neighborly, and the food was always great, and the sermons, and then the movies that they showed were kind of scary about the Antichrist and that kind of stuff. That was kind of scary stuff. But other than that, they were great neighbors, great friends, and so that's my kind of similar to you. I had some years at around that age going to church, and so later moving to Vancouver. We have a large mosque in Richmond, which is called the Al Jamia Mosque for the BC Muslim Association, which, interestingly enough, I'm now a vice president of that association, which is 17 mosques across British Columbia. Wow. And so they had this big chart there that had the Arabic name of the prophet, and they had the English names, and then I saw Jesus, and I was like, I thought Islam, because at that time I didn't have really much background or understanding about faith and religion, and so when I saw that, I was like, hey, I've been hearing a lot about Jesus, so I was happy to know there was a connection. And so in my later journey in life, when I learned more about the Islamic scripture and the stories of the prophets, I appreciated the parallels and the story and the lessons from his life as well. So that's a little bit of my story, and then just going back to kind of connecting with you. And I know the United Church has always been very welcoming. As far as I can recall, whenever I've communicated with faith-based organizations, I would say the most welcoming to other communities and other leaders, as far as in my experience anyway, has been the United Church. And just out of curiosity, as I don't understand various Christian theology. There's Protestants, there's Catholics, there's other Baptist, evangelical. How does the United Church fit into all of this?
The United Church of Canada is an amalgamation of 5 denominations over a period of 40 years. In the early 1900s, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists all found themselves in Canada in different pockets in different parts of the country. And for economy of scale, to not have every denomination have these the same buildings, the same for economies of scale, particularly on the prairies, union talks began in the early 1900s, interrupted by the war, picked up again, and the United Church of Canada is the union of 4 denominations in 1925. In 1925, because union talks has already started, a few congregations, a handful on the prairies, and actually in BC, began to be unionist churches. So they were called unionist churches. They joined in 1925. And it was an act of parliament that formed the United Church of Canada. And then in 1965, mid-60s, I think it was 65, the Evangelical United Brethren joined, which brought actually congregations from Bermuda to be part of the United Church of Canada. So that's kind of weird. But where this fits is those denominations are part of the great Protestant Reformation of the 1500s, 1600s, when, and it began really, the story is that Martin Luther, a Catholic priest, posted 95 protests or theses or questions on the door of the cathedral, local church, which launched the Reformation. And it really had Reformation from the mother church at the time, the Roman Catholic Church, were all grounded in the same story. In fact, the last time the entire church agreed on anything when we agreed on the doctrine of the Trinity, where God is one in three, and understood in God, the single the single monotheistic God is understood in three manifestations, or three ways of life. So, and that's the last time the church agreed. Since then, we've disagreed about a bunch of things all the way. And so, and because the church is a human institution, that's why, right? Like, as much as it's anything, it's a human institution. And when we disagree enough, we actually separate. So there's been major schisms in the mother church, the first church, the Church of Peter, throughout the 2200 years of the faith.
And now with the United Church in Canada and your role in British Columbia, how many congregations are united here in British Columbia and Southern Alberta? I believe is part of the Pacific region, and then throughout Canada, how many congregations would there be?
Oh my gosh. I'm going to say 147 congregations in British Columbia. Our executive minister, who serves two regions, serves in two regions. I'm the president of Pacific Mountain region. There is a president of Southern Alberta, which is the Chinookwins region. So I'm just going to talk about BC. And BC and a little bit of Alberta and the Yukon. So that's the Pacific Mountain region. And there's about 140, I want to say 147 congregations. And across the country, there's about 3,000.
Wow, that's huge.
3,000 United Church of, the United Church of Canada is the largest Protestant denomination in the country.
Got it. And so it must be like, with your roles, to communicate with 147 congregations in the Pacific region, that must be quite a big task, just to, in terms of communication, relationships, and how do you manage that?
The COVID has taught us a number of things, Tarek. We've not been very good at, I want to say that this judicatory grew out of, we shrunk the judicatory, which is to say we used to have two levels of governance between the national church and the congregation. Now we just have one. So responsibilities grew and oversight grew. Congregations used to be connected more tightly in smaller groups. But now COVID has taught us that we need to be in conversation with everybody regularly. So we have a town hall with our people every 2 weeks. In the initial stages of the pandemic, it was weekly, just staying in touch, helping people to be in touch. And we would bring people, leaders from different aspects of ministry, or we've had Bonnie Henry participate, we've had Adrian Dix participate in our town halls, and just to say, here's where we're at. But that's taught us about staying connected in terms of, what do we want to be about as a region? What do we want to be about in partnership with the communities that we serve? And so we've made a commitment. One of the identity pieces, there's a couple of identity pieces that we've actually said, in light of what's happened in the past year, we've committed to be an anti-racist denomination. And we are developing programs. We've actually created a staff position where in our justice portfolio that will handle that identity piece. So we'll see programs begin to roll out what that looks like. We're also questioning the call to become an affirming ministry of the United Church. An affirming ministry is fully inclusive of the LGBTQ2S community. So, and the reason we say that is because it's completely consistent with the tradition. It's completely consistent with who we believe Jesus to have been. So that's just, this is the identity piece of the denomination in the region. We're working away on those things. And we're doing that by being in touch with our people, the key leaders of congregations, ministers who serve congregations, and their people who represent the congregation at the regional level.
And
was that helpful?
Yeah, and also the community work for the general public. And on the downtown east side, the First United Church, and also we have our own location. It's called the Muslim Care Center, which is actually similar to what you all are doing on the downtown east side. It's just feeding everybody and everybody to help them, at least from what we're doing. So we started with daily food distribution, and now we've incorporated counseling and addiction support because, again, human beings are we're holistic. We have so many needs. So one is our physical needs of food, shelter, and clothing, but our emotional needs and our, and there are addiction is a mental illness. It's no amount of conversations, logic, reason. When somebody has an addiction, it's become a mental illness, and it has to be treated as such without the stigma. As many communities dealing with addiction, there's a different approach. So we have this holistic approach to really help people, Muslims and non-Muslims, to hopefully overcome mental illness and addiction. So please share with us similar, because you guys have been doing it quite a long time, the services that the United Church offers, not only for your community, but for the general public.
So my role in the region is to serve as the spiritual leader, to bring a theological perspective to all of the ministries. My job is to hold in prayer all of the various expressions of the denomination throughout the region. I don't actually know specifically what various ministries are doing. Downtown East Side, campus ministries, camping. We have an amazing camping ministry. We work Indigenous communities in the north. Like, I don't know specifically what's happening on the ground in each one of those. I do know that First United Church in the downtown East Side is directed by a brilliant theologian and director. Her name is Carmen Lansdowne, and I encourage you to put her on in this podcast to have a conversation about what they're doing, because they're just about to launch a major capital campaign to completely rebuild their building and they've received a beautiful gift that launched this program. So they're looking to add shelter space, program space, to create community amongst the folks in the downtown East Side. It's not something we do for people, it's something we do with people. And there's a difference. It's not, and we're just learning how to do this better. But the person to talk to, Carmen Lansdowne.
Absolutely, and that'll be definitely on my list to go and do. And with our spiritual similarities, in our faith, the neighbor, taking care of the neighbor, regardless of the background, and so whether the prophet Jesus in our faith and in Islam, the prophet Muhammad, peace be upon them both, that this kind of care for one another, regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds, to help people if they need food, if they need help, they need a shoulder to lean on, and it's a common thing in many faiths to help those that are in need. And so, in terms of, as you said, the United Church has many different areas of helping people. So one is, again, the downtown East Side. This is actually the most per capita overdose deaths of opioids in North America. More people died of opioid overdoses on the downtown East Side than did the coronavirus. So that just shows how pervasive that is. And I think part of people kind of, everyone has their journey, but as faith-based communities, to help people from the spiritual perspective, because when people turn to drugs and mental health issues, faith is a way to pull them out.
It's certainly a way. Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says to his disciples, he's tested by a lawyer, what is the most important law? And Jesus said, what does it say in the scriptures? And he's talking about the Hebrew scriptures, because that's the only scriptures there were then. And the lawyer says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is as important as the first. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, on these two laws hang everything else. Everything else has to do with loving God and loving neighbor. Those are that's the heart of the faith. That is the heart of the practice, because it takes practice. When you say love neighbor as yourself, it assumes that you love yourself, or it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You'll love your neighbor to the exact degree that you love yourself. And when I think about addictions and hard times, and there's a lack of self-love that leads us up that road, right? And that belongs to an entire society of which we're a part, right? I don't believe people get to the downtown east side by themselves. A former director once said to me, as I was exploring the downtown east side, a former director of First United Church once said to me, the downtown east side is a microcosm of every system failure. It's a system failure it's a justice system failure, education system, family systems, healthcare system. Every system failure that you could imagine, the downtown east side comprises. It's a microcosm of every system failure, and that's absolutely true. When you see that, so when you say system, we're part of that system. You and I are part of that system, right? So it's not, as I said earlier, this is not them and us. This is us. This is who we are. This is the level of our capacity to be human with each other, and systems fail sometimes. So.
And you're right. And when these systems fails, it's the neighbors, it's the other folks that can step in and just back to kind of the Muslim Care Center, and part of in our faith is that we are literally responsible for our neighbors 40 doors to the left, 40 doors to the right, 40 doors to the north and the south. I was like, I haven't been able to fulfill that myself personally. I'm aspirational. That is something. And part of the care center was, again, who are the neighbors that need the most sense, with our respective team members, the dozens and dozens, hundreds of people that volunteer and help out, donate, contribute. And in 1400 years ago, in the time of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the companions, when they were talking about the rights of the neighbors, they were afraid that the rights of the neighbors would be so much that they would even have to take part in the inheritance of the estate of the people. That's how big the rights of the neighbor is. And so we live in a beautiful city, in a beautiful province, and our social justice in our country and in our province and our city is quite amazing compared to many other places in the world. I know we do get our fair share of criticism, but I think you and I speaking today from different faiths, yet we have a brotherhood in faith and brotherhood for humanity of how we can really work together in various ways. And I'll share with you a story. We were, after the shootings in Quebec at a mosque in Quebec City, where a right-wing extremist came and shot many people, killed many people, and it was a traumatizing moment for the Muslim community of Canada. And so we had, I would say, thousands of people came from every denomination, Christians, Jews, other faith, Sikhs, Hindus. People came from every walk of life with the candles, with cards, with flowers, with tears in their eyes to our various mosques to show their kind of solidarity and that they're sharing in the condolences and the sorrow of the community. And so we were so heartened by the visits that people came to our mosque and coming into the mosque and praying with us. And so what we did was with Islam Unravelled was we thought, well, if people are willing to come and visit us, we may as well come visit them at the churches and the synagogues as friends and neighbors, and to attend services, and then to also invite the folks to come and join us for our services as friends and neighbors, observers, and then just general Q&A. And what was interesting, so we went to Crossroads United Church, graciously invitation by Rev Carey, and
Awesome.
what we found out, what was interesting was she had the topic of the sermon when we came, what would Jesus forward in an email? And as we know, a lot of kind of disinformation and sometimes fabricated information kind of gets disseminated by about certain groups and other faiths. And so we're living in a unique time where hate speech and racism is accelerated much more so with social media and the internet than it ever has been. And I think maybe naively 10 years ago, we all used to think maybe racism is going down, but it's actually intensifying with the speed of the internet, social networking, where right-wing extremists and extremists of all kinds, whether in every religion, are somehow connecting. And so when we came to the church, we're very welcome, a gracious host from everybody there. But the members of the congregation did have these fears, these worries, these concerns about Muslims. So, Sharia laws, somehow Muslims have some sort of conspiracy to bring Sharia law into Canada, and then things like female genital mutilation, which has nothing to do with our faith whatsoever. But certain things are presented in a format online that looks factual, but it's complete disinformation. And as a result, it hardens prejudices and biases. And then in the worst case, it motivates people to do violent acts. And so when we talk about being anti-racist, and one thing is being an inclusive society, but to be like, okay, well, what, we come from so many different countries as Christians, as Muslims, as Jews from different countries, and we all coexist in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. So in terms of the United Church and anti-racism, please describe that kind of how that came together and the expression of that, because I'm sure the United Church comprises of many ethnicities and many races from around the world as well.
Well, it came from it's been percolating to actually be declarative or overt or intentional about our relationship to other ethnicities. The National Church has declared itself to be the United Church of Canada's General Council, which is a body not unlike the Pacific region, only it's the next level up, right? It's our mother church. And they've declared that that this will be a denomination that will be a non-racist church. And it was partially in response to to what we saw in the United States in last year with the death of George Floyd on social media. It was partially in response to that. But we've been working away at intercultural relationships for a number of years. We have relationships with the Korean Presbyterian Church. We've visited back and forth. We've as I say, we've been to Bermuda. We've been we've been working away at relationships for a long time, and we recognize that we're inherently white, we have European roots for the most part, but even Europeans were very nice to each other in the first years of the early 1900s, right? So we're trying to break down the walls that divide us. We've been trying to do that in our music. We've been trying to do that in the way we understand the scriptures. We've been trying to do that in our interfaith conversations. I've hosted a number of interfaith conversations in the congregations that I've served, where Jews and Muslims would gather together and just talk about what's the same, what's different, and all of that. And no one is more right than the other, because God made God's creation, and God knows that God is going to find any way God can to be in relationship with what God made. And if that's going to be with you, Tarek, through a Muslim socialization and enculturalization and a religion, then that's what God's going to choose to do, because God has agency in what God created. So why wouldn't it be of God? Right? And what we watch is what's the wake. You could believe that the doorknob on my door is God, but what does it leave behind? Does it love God? Does it love neighbor? Does it create justice? Does it include and affirm that life is a gift and we are to cherish it in every person that we encounter? All of that, right? So it was an official kind of motion that was made in one of our general meetings, but it grew out of that. And now we've begun to actually put some legs on it, so that our executive minister, Trina Duncan, has established a new staff position that she will be hiring for. She's actually in the process of hiring for this justice position, to where this portfolio will live.
Absolutely, and you know what? It actually brings in line some of our scripture where Allah says in the Holy Quran that we've created you from different nations and different tribes so that you may get to know one another. And so if we were all the same, it wouldn't be that interesting. And because we are very different in different ways, in different kind of ethnic, cultural, even cuisine and language, and all these backgrounds serve as a way to be like, oh, how do you guys do this, and how do you do
Right.
that,
Totally.
and this conversation in and of itself, like,
Right.
is a great way for maybe communities that may not necessarily get together on a regular basis to be able to hear one another, to respect one another, and again, our respective faiths have coexisted for centuries
Right.
throughout the world, and now we're here in the new world, which is relatively young. We're in a kind of city and province that, in the grand scheme of history, at least for people that are not First Nations, that we are
Right.
somehow here together in a new world, in a new land, and let's talk about our hosts, our First Nations peoples
Right.
that were here before us, and our relationship on unceded territory. And I will say, um, just to share with you my reading habits, I used to love an author by the name of Louis L'Amour, which
Oh, yes.
talked about the Great West, the Old West, and the way he reverently portrayed the First Nations people and natives from the United States, and I really like that simplicity of lifestyle, and how they lived off the land, and they only used what they needed. And so I always grew up with a great appreciation for their culture, their way of life, the Great Spirit. They're very similar to kind of our kind of thoughts in our faith, and obviously there's several differences, but in terms of the United Church and the work with our First Nations brothers and sisters, please talk about that throughout the province, throughout Canada, that work your community is doing.
Wow. In 1986, the moderator of the United Church of Canada, my role at the national level, the spiritual leader of the church at the time, at a general council meeting, issued an apology to First Nations elders for our involvement in the treatment of I'm choked. You have to, I'm just wanting you to know that I'm choked by this, because this reconciling work is, we're never reconciled. It's a process, right? But in 1986, an apology was issued, and I remember the response, the apology was never accepted. The apology was heard. And then I think the words were, well, let's see what you're going to do about it. And so the whole, and then the effects of the residential school began to emerge out of that apology, and our own denomination's involvement in residential schools is pretty horrific. And so we issued that apology as well. Our church, in the lawsuits that were the class action suits against the government of Canada, we were held vicariously responsible for some of those atrocities, and so our denomination lives with that sinfulness. And I'll use that word. I rarely use that word, but that's corporate sin, right? And so we live with that, and then we begin to do the reconciling work. And so we work with Indigenous communities. We work with, and just be on the ground and be present and be there. Personally, when I served in another congregation in North Vancouver, and I began my own journey of leading a reconciling congregation, when I encountered the Kairos blanket exercise at an event at Vancouver School of Theology. Two beautiful Indigenous women led us through this blanket exercise, where blankets are laid on the floor representing Turtle Island or North America, and gradually through how the land has been stripped away and traded, and to have that real visceral experience. I mean, it makes me quiet. I just want to not talk about it and just simply be in relationship and say, wow, we just have lots of work to do, because we're on unceded territory. Economically, what does that even mean? How do we even make it? How do we make a treaty? And does it mean money? What does it mean? Like, those are living questions for us, and we're circling the questions because we're trying to find respect again.
Absolutely, and I think what happens is when we come to new societies and new countries, we tend to think other people should believe what we believe, or their culture and their way of life should be like our way of life. And so I think part of just personally my journey, although born in Canada, raised in Canada, and respect that identity of being Canadian and British Columbian and being from Vancouver, but then there's that thousands of years of history of the Indian subcontinent, of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh being one subcontinent, and to go on my own cultural and spiritual journey of my cultural identity and the language, the cuisine. And to be honest, my language abilities of our Punjabi and Urdu are let's just say not quite, not that good. And then Arabic, which is the spiritual language and the spiritual kind of basis of identity, to learn that and to understand it to the little bit of a degree that I have. And so to appreciate that it doesn't mean it's one or the other. I am Canadian. I love my country. I love my province, my city, but also I am from the subcontinent, and that's my culture, that's my identity, that's my language, it's our and then my faith. And so I think in a similar way, just like with European heritage, there's a rich history from the United Kingdom, from Scotland, from Ireland, from France, Germany, and that is the heritage and the identity, or whether it's Africa, and then now coming back to our First Nations peoples, their language, their identity, their culture, their way of life. And it may be completely different to maybe how our respective cultures have done things, the governance, the kind of systems. And sometimes I think maybe well-meaning on maybe in the sense that, well, our ways are better. And I think that is where I think this is where the rub is that who's to say whose way of life is any better than the other's way of life. And I think from at least the journey that I've been on, to appreciate people for who they are, what they believe, and their cultures, their languages, their traditions, and how we can be different and still respect and get along with one another.
I spoke about what is the trail of your faith. What do you leave in your wake? And colonial settlers, as far as, and it's still true, it's still a living legacy, left a trail of anguish and heartbreak and cultural almost genocide, right? And if I don't own that, then I cannot be part of the solution. Because as much as I want to claim what my ancestors, the good of what my ancestors brought, I have to claim that dark side if it's going to be reconciled. So what we've left behind as European settlers, and I claim that, my one side of my family came from Britain, from Scotland, Ireland, Northern, and another part of my family came from Norway, through the United States, came up and got land on the prairie in the early 1900s, on land that wasn't theirs. The government just gave it away, right? It was free, just right. And so and we just assumed that was okay. And that's still true. That legacy is still present. Although on the prairie, some treaties got signed, but they weren't fair from our perspective. If we were signing those treaties, if we were the victims of those treaties, we would not be happy, right? If we own that, then we can move towards, then we can say, so what does reconciliation look like? What does restoration and treaty look like? If I'm going to use an indigenous term, what does treaty look like? I'm going to use that term. I don't use it. I let them use it because it's their word, not mine, and I don't want to appropriate that. But what does it look like? And we're, as I say, we're just circling each other right now to find respect again, and to
please go ahead. Please go ahead.
And to name that that's true, I think is important. We're just trying to find that respect level again, because we have to own that we're white. I have to own that I'm part of the white colonial settler, and that oppression is a wake that's left behind. That's the trail I leave behind.
And I think, again, just going back to how the European heritage informs a certain understanding of ownership of land, whereas there's this movie depicting the last days of Sitting Bull, and it's called "I Left My Heart at Wounded Knee,"
right.
And they were talking about the treaties, again, very, very, very unfavorable treaties, and about land, and this is how much land, and then certain promises made, promises broken, and certain things that were done that were, again, egregious to the First Nations people. And Sitting Bull, the chief, they were talking as the nation about land ownership, and they were talking about how in the native language of their tribe, there's no word for land ownership. There's no word for, so we understand things according to our culture, our language, and then we think, well, they should understand land ownership, whereas in the culture there's not even a word for ownership of land, because it's like for us to have that sense we own this land, whereas we are maybe just kind of by God's grace or Allah's grace benefiting from the land, but to own it is a big statement. I own this land, and I think that from the First Nations perspective, they lived off the land, but they didn't own the land per se, other than this identity of other cultures saying, well, there should be a land ownership, and that causes divisions right from the get-go.
Right from the get-go. And it was always about land. It's always about land. This conversation is about land, right? And it always has been.
And the way of life is seasonal. Like live,
correct.
live,
absolutely,
live according to the season, go to different grazing grounds at different times of the year. So to stay in one fixed location, like obviously in other countries, you stay in your village, your town, your city, and you kind of have your government from there. But the way of life, the native way of life, the First Nations way of life, is live off the land according to the season, and to be in one fixed place was anathema to their identity.
Correct. You know that our traditions, Islam and Christianity, are grounded in agrarian cultures. We were nomadic gatherers. That's what we did. You know, the story of Abraham moving to a land that I will show you is that's what that's about. And so we have in our own DNA the capacity to say thank you for the use of this land that is not ours. We've it's been enculturated out.
Yes.
Right?
And same with Moses, like actually the Quran itself, majority of the stories are about, or the most referenced prophet, I should say, is Moses, peace be upon him. And part of the lessons of he had to leave, right? He had to leave his land, and go to a new place. And so it is again, we should be able to understand it, but I think, again, when people look different, when the skin color is different, the language is different, the clothing is different, the way of life is different, and we're like, well, and I think certain stronger societies, maybe economically or maybe in weaponry or what have you, want to impose the will and culture that might makes right, where it doesn't make right. It does create a very serious injustice.
Agreed. So I get why people reject religion altogether. I get why they say it's not served the world at all. I understand that perspective. I can get how you can get there really easily. You know, and that's why these kinds of conversations are super important.
Absolutely.
The Tower of Babel story in the Hebrew scriptures is all about, we got to know each other too closely. We spoke each other's languages, and we built this tower to heaven, and God knocked it down and said, I'm going to divide you up because you're too close. Because we we often come to believe that we get close to God, that we're like, God is saying, you're not God, I'm God, and I'll be your God, but you'll be my people, not God. Right?
Yeah.
And that's what,
and our human nature is, there is a sense that if we, like, again, going back to my great-grandfather and grandfather came from India before Pakistan existed in 1904 to Washington State, and then up here to British Columbia. And again, economic reasons was the motivator. And I'm sure forefathers from Europe coming to the West was, hey, we can make a new life. We can have our own land. We can have our own level of success. And there was an economic incentive that we can make something of ourselves in the new world. But then I think what nobody really understood, this was at the expense of our First Nations brothers and sisters. So that economic incentive had a drastic cost.
Absolutely. We did not listen. We did not we weren't curious at all. We knew it from the place where no flowers can grow in the spring. I just quoted a poem, right? We were completely and utterly disrespectful for the sake of monetary gain. Absolutely.
For the sake of monetary gain, and even I'll just share with you, from Punjab, the region of India and Pakistan that we're from, culturally, land ownership is it's a very significant thing. Owning land is a cultural identity, whereas many faiths have, like, having land, owning something has some level of, I have something, whereas it's complete opposite to the First Nations, where the land is the Great Spirits, or
it's
and
not
we're
ours.
here to, it's not ours. And I think this is where, again, for millennia, people have fought over land, and when we see world maps of how people expand and contract, is based on on land and conquest.
Yep. It's been all about that from the start.
So I think from the healing that we are neighbors, we do come from different belief systems and different cultures, and but I will say that, really great to speak with you, because again, one thing is the conscience of not recognizing the significance of a destruction of a society. And then I think what I love about Canada is we're trying to make amends. We're trying to do the right thing. It may be 100 years too late, but still, or 150 years too late, but still, there's an effort. It's not like trying to sweep it under the rug. There's a consistent effort at even 2021, where all of our faith-based communities and all the secular communities are trying to make it right in whatever way. And it may not be a perfect solution, but there's, at least through this conversation from the United Church and yourself, like there's efforts being made for reconciliation, and efforts being made to try and right a wrong, which you know, it's at least the intention. And part of our faith is intention. Is if you make the intention to do good, you get the reward as if you've done it. So it starts with the intention, and then we have to follow it through. So maybe Rev Blair, in closing, in respect of your time to share this hour with us on our program, maybe a final message or sentiment that we could share with the listeners, that you know, how we can all kind of work together and coexist as faiths, as we have done for centuries.
Wow. Jesus says to his followers, and I just pull this and say, I think Jesus says this to the world. I think Jesus says that of life. I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. And abundance is not about stuff. It's about the fullness of becoming fully who you've been created to be, in the image and likeness of the one who created you, and to steward it in the way, in the image and likeness of the one who created you. We've been called to be stewards of the creation, of relationships with each other, and we're called to steward it in the way that we've been created. We're called to steward in the way that God would steward it. And so that's purely invitational, because I don't have a corner on the market of what that looks like. I know that when I have this conversation with you, I get a bigger window. Oh, it could look like this. And if I can remain curious and be open to the promise of abundant life for not just me, but for the entire planet, including all of creation, that we live abundantly, not selfishly, abundantly, and we give away so that others can live. That's what, that would be my greatest hope.
Fantastic. And I'll share with you one part of our faith which echoes that, and this is in Arabic, and I'll translate. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. So it starts with in the name of Allah, the gracious and the merciful, and protect us from Satan the accursed. So that is our protection, asking for protection from Satan. And then all praise to the Lord of all that exists, Ar-Rahman, the compassion, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, Malik Yawmiddin, master of the day of judgment. Iyaka na'budu, you alone we worship. Iyaka nasta'in, you alone we seek help. Ihdina siratal mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. I'm going to have to go back, because linguistically, Arabic is not my first language. And so, and then he goes, but not those have earned your anger or went astray. So it is kind of beneficence as faith, people of faith, that we acknowledge that God and Allah and our creation, as our creator, obviously wants the best for us. And this is a world of test. This is a world where we have to do our part to make things right. And so I really appreciate you taking your time to share with us and discuss our respective faiths and our respective commitment to our communities. And it is something that I'm looking forward to working with you in the future on many works to benefit our greater society, including our First Nations people.
Bless you, Tarek. It's been a joy to talk to you. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to connecting with you soon. Thank you again.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye now.